Thanks, Lauren. Happy for you all to have joined us today. We're here in the ZED-2 Reactor, as Lauren mentioned. As part of Science Literacy Week, we want to give you a little tour and have you meet a few reactor scientists. So myself, I'm a reactor scientist here at CNL, specifically a physicist. So my title is Applied Physicist. I work in the Applied Physics branch, and the large area of my responsibility of work is the ZED-2 Reactor. So we're going to start really big in terms of, of our discussion of nuclear power today. So we're going to start at the very top, nuclear power, then we're going to look at it in Canada and Ontario specifically, and then we're going to tie all that into ZED-2. So we'll jump to a slide of the CANDU reactor and showing what a CANDU reactor does. So the way you create power from fission in a nuclear reactor is like this. You have a neutron, a small neutral particle that can take apart and remove the heat energy from uranium. So you have uranium, great big heavy atom. A neutron comes along and jumps in there, and it becomes so unstable that it splits apart into fission products. And in that release, in that splitting, there is a lot of heat energy that comes out. So in a conventional power generator, you might be burning natural gas or coal, and a nuclear reactor really works much the same, in that you're just generating heat to create steam, and that steam generator turns a great big turbine, and that turbine generates electricity, which is then distributed to the rest of us. So that's at a really high level, a CANDU reactor plant, and that's just one type of nuclear reactor. There are many throughout the world, past and present and future as well. And so what happens in Ontario, we'll jump to the next slide, is that a very large chunk of our energy comes from nuclear. So you can see at the bottom there, 25%, and we're really lucky to have that. That's made a huge difference as far as our carbon emissions, and we have a very strong baseload generation because of that. So these reactors are enormous. Some of you may have seen pictures, and what you see behind you and what we see the control room of here right now is not that big. So how do we connect from something very abstract like nuclear fission and removing energy from the splitting of a very heavy atom down to what we have here? So here in ZED-2, which is a bit of an acronym standing for zero energy deuterium, we also split atoms. We don't do it nearly on the same scale as a CANDU reactor would, but the same principle applies. So the same physics of that neutron, that small particle, coming along and breaking apart this very large particle happens here as well. A CANDU might be 700 megawatts electric power. ZED-2 is more like 100 watts. So you're talking about the thermal power of a light bulb. So the difference is pretty staggering. And if you have a light bulb in the room you're in right now, look at that and imagine that's roughly the same amount of thermal energy coming out. So that's pretty impressive. And yeah, let's start with looking at the control room. Here we are. ZED-2 was built in 1958 and 59, and right now we've got 59 years of operation under our belt. So first critical was September 7th in 1960, and here we are in 2019 and still operating. The reactor is a heavy water tank type, heavy water moderated, and right now we're in the control room. And so when I say heavy water moderated and tank type, it's also, you need to picture a large tank that we fill up with water, and so the reactivity control is done by pumping in heavy water. And I'll show you the fuel later so you can see how things are arranged. And an operator would be sitting at this bench right here, pumping water, watching their power rate of rise, and so the reactor is completely manually controlled, which very few reactors are. Typically there'd be some sort of feedback loop to help keep power in check, but here it's all by intervention of the operator, which is really neat. So there, as you can see, there's not that many dials to monitor. There are there's a few instrumentation ports that mine different power levels at different parts of the reactor, and otherwise it's a fairly simple machine. which has recently also undergone some digitization as well and a lot of upgrades. So we're really looking forward to the future here. Paper chart recorders for many years, many decades were the way here. So with that, I think we've seen the control room. There's obviously a lot more to it, but I'd like to keep going on our tour. So we're going to go over to the top of Reactor. All right, so here we are. We'll go to a quick cutaway first of what ZED-2 is all about. So here's the control room just in. Here's this large tank that I was referring to earlier. So you can see some rods and a water level, and that in its heart is the reactor. You take an arrangement of nuclear fuel, of uranium, and you add heavy water, which is a really good moderator, and Canada has a long tradition of heavy water type reactors. And then you're able to achieve a self-sustaining reaction. So when one part I didn't mention earlier is when that neutron comes along and breaks apart a heavy uranium, you have 2 and a bit more neutrons come out on average. So if you're putting in 1 and you're getting out 2, sometimes 3, you can obviously see that there's some kind of opportunity there for a chain reaction to occur, because if those other 2 neutrons go and they also split uranium atoms, then you've doubled your neutron count again, say. So the whole goal of a reactor is to create a critical pile where you've got no need for further input, but instead the reaction is self-driving. And obviously that needs to be controlled with different features so that you don't have it run away. So criticality in making as many as you lose is a bit of a knife edge, and you can end up on either side of that. But the goal here is to come up to that exact critical state, and that is brought on by a particular arrangement. So we're going to move through a bit of a tour of what the reactor is all about now. And just for convenience, because we really can't drag along the camera on all this on this tour and be very good live, we're going to cut to some pictures which should illustrate the case pretty well. But first, we'll start at the top of the reactor up here. We'll move down through the different rooms, and finally we'll end up on some Q&A. And so after we finish this tour, some colleagues are going to join me, and we're going to talk to you a bit about what it's like to be a reactor scientist, how we got here, what we do, all that sort of thing. And hopefully you'll have lots of questions for us as well. So here's the top of the reactor for ZED-2. As you can see, it's not very big. The tank itself is about 3 meters in diameter and 3 meters high. And for those of you who are familiar with the NRU reactor, that's about the same size of vessel. Obviously, NRU is a very different machine and much higher in power. So what we're trying to do here with ZED-2 is really to reproduce the material and the geometry of a reactor and reproduce the same physics in order to understand what our models and data tell us. So if our models aren't good, or if our data isn't good for how these reactors operate, we would be able to determine that just by an experiment here. So if, say, we conduct an experiment and we know what happened and when it went critical, but then we compare later to a simulation or to somebody's calculation and things just don't add up, the whole purpose of ZED-2 was to reconcile those things and help improve models and improve data. And so it was built originally in 1960 with the purpose of doing that for the power reactor program in Canada. And so it's served very well for that. And then it continues to be used for the power reactor program and many other programs that we're exploring right now also. The reactor is covered with a large deck plate, and then there's beams running horizontally. From these beams, we hang the fuel assemblies. The fuel assemblies can be hung in virtually any arrangement or geometry, and we'll just have a look. We'll cut to the picture top of reactor, and so what we see there is actually from this very spot, more or less, a fuel assembly being removed. So the fuel assembly, you don't see a lot of detail. You see an aluminum can, basically. This is one of the bundles that's inside. So this is a dummy fuel bundle, a CANDU 37 element bundle. Now this is a dummy, as I mentioned, or else normally it'd be quite a bit heavier, more like 20 kilograms, so I wouldn't be able to heft it as easily. But what we do in ZED-2 then, as I mentioned, when we're trying to reproduce the material and geometry of a CANDU, say in this case, we put in a lot of the real things. So we'll put in a real fuel bundle. We'll put it in a real container, which is about the size of the fuel assembly, and then we'll operate the reactor. The neat thing about ZED-2 is that there's no heating, because as you can imagine, trying to use a 100-watt light bulb to heat up the reactor would take quite a bit. But what I told you about power reactors, the whole purpose is to heat up water. So we're not really even in the heating water regime, but the neat thing is we can still get the same physics. The neutrons see the material in the reactor much as they would in the real case. So we've got a lot of aluminum channels like what you see in that picture. We've got this fuel bundle hung vertically, and say, for instance, in the current core we have there's 44 of those fuel assemblies. And typically, about 5 assemblies per bundle. And so that's sufficient for us to make a critical reaction happen. So I think we're going to move on down now to the next part of the reactor. So let's jump to the next photo. And this is the actual entrance to the reactor room. So I'm standing on top right now. Normally there's these shield doors to the left and right of me which would have closed. And what you're looking at in this picture is the reactor room door, which is open. There's an ion chamber in front of it. So one of the neat things we do here in ZED-2 is we calibrate ion chambers. ZED-2 is really good for that because it's very low power, and low power means low activation. So normally in a big full-scale reactor, if you put something in, it will become hot. Neutrons tend to activate things, and so that means that they usually put it into a more unstable state, which then later has to decay, and there's always some radiation associated with that decay. But ZED-2, the fuel, the ion chambers, all these things can be put in with very minimal activation. And so ZED-2 is then ideal for fleet calibrations of ion chambers and different detectors for CANDU. And so you see one pictured in front of the reactor room there. And the reactor room, with its great big door for biological shielding, has within it the graphite. And so we'll show a photo of the graphite. And that is what we call a graphite reflector. So some reactors are graphite moderated, whereas ours is heavy water moderated. And graphite is just a really good material for slowing down neutrons. See, when they come out from fission, they're going quite fast. And in order to make them fission with uranium again, you literally need to slow them down. And usually you do that by collision, which is hopefully not the way you slow down most things. But anyway, in this case for neutrons, they will bounce off carbon atoms, say, for graphite. Or in our case, in the heavy water, they'll bounce off deuterium atoms. And that will eventually slow the neutron down. So surrounding the outside of this reactor, we've got graphite blocks, which are about 60 centimeters thick and help reflect back in the neutrons. So not only do they scatter, but they can also get the neutrons turned back around and send them back into the core. But even though the reactor is just 100 watts, there's still fields which you wouldn't want to be exposed to personally. And so that's why there's this great big concrete biological shield surrounding the reactor as well. So now we're about midway down on our reactor tour. We'll go to the next photo. And we're at the dump valve room. So we've got the reactor full of water. We've got the fuel running away. How do we make sure that we're able to flush away the water, say, if we have some undesirable power transient, or if we realize, like, oh, something doesn't seem quite right, let's back out. So the safety system for ZED-2 is really neat. It's 3 18-inch dump lines that open up, and they very quickly drop the moderator out of the core. So what happens then, once there's no more moderators slow down the neutrons and cause subsequent fissions, is that the reaction shuts down very quickly. So this is the prime safety system for ZED-2, and that's what shuts everything down. So there's certain limits set that prompt this trip response. So if one of those limits is exceeded, the reactor will trip. So it's a neat safety system, very dependable, and again, it's very fast acting. So we can go on to the very last slide. and that's the dump tanks. And so this is where the heavy water both is stored, but then also would be sent in event of a moderator drain. We can also drain in a controlled manner, which is really the way we always do drain, where you very slowly allow water to bypass one of the dump valves and go back into the tanks. But the tanks are where everything is stored. So this is way down in the sub-basement. There's a significant inventory of heavy water that we use to go critical. And it's all really part and parcel with the can-do legacy, in that was the direction that Canadian power reactors were chosen to take. The heavy water moderated and the pressure tube, calandria tube geometry, which I haven't really discussed yet. So with that, I invite you again to please send in any questions that you might have of what you've seen. A few things come to mind. I've mentioned the size of the reactor. I've mentioned the utilization as well. So flux detector calibrations, power reactor proofing, and what we call validation of codes. We've also had a very interesting history of supporting the NRU and NRX reactors as well. Because ZED-2 is really an empty tank and doesn't have to look like anything specific, we've been able to mock up some very different looking lattices in the reactor. And so some of these, for instance, have been to reproduce the NRU, or a snapshot of the NRU reactor and what it looks like. And experiments were done to look at molybdenum-99 targets within ZED-2, but it's really all about understanding the reactor physics of them. And so that's sometimes what separates a reactor like ZED-2 and a reactor like NRU. One of them is really more about materials and how things hold up to really high powers, high bombardments, whereas ZED-2 is more about just the physics and just the physics of neutrons interacting with the same environment. So it's made it a very powerful test tool because you're able to remove some of the effects of temperature. There's feedback mechanisms, so as temperature changes, like with most physical properties, there are changes in those physical properties, and that includes how the neutrons interact with a material. So it's really, really important to understand all that and to demonstrate that in what we call integral type experiments. So ZED-2 is one of very few left in the world. There's two others that I'm aware of that are like it, tank type heavy water reactors. We're very fortunate to still have this one here, and we've been really busy of late with work for the federal under the Federal Science and Technology Initiative and commercial work, and so it's been an exciting time for me to have been working here as a relatively recent hire. Pardon me. The one last thing that I'll mention is. So I mentioned the facility is quite old, and I think we're all used to seeing old reactors shut down. But ZED-2 is a bit of a different thing. You'll notice I'm standing on top of the deck of a fueled reactor, and my dosimetry isn't going off or anything. And so ZED-2 is operated at low powers for such a long time that it hasn't created a significant activation in the surrounding materials. And even fuel, actually, in ZED-2 is still considered fresh fuel from a context of handling, which is a really neat thing to see. And often when we have guests who are coming from power reactors or bigger research reactors, it's quite a thing for them to process or to realize like that difference. So we're really lucky to have a unique facility in Canada and a very rare facility in the world at our disposal here for our tests and ongoing support of federal initiatives and commercial work and really just preserving a legacy of nuclear here in Chalk River. Finally, just one more historical note. The ZED-2 reactor is actually, the 2 indicates that, second in a series. And so the first one was ZEEP, and that was the first criticality outside of the United States on September 5th, 1945, so quite a few years ago. That was quite an accomplishment for Canada as a reasonably small nation. And that really has set the stage for ZED-2, what it is, but also for the entire nuclear industry in Canada, making those early gains. We still have the fuel from ZEEP actually in the facility. which is a really neat thing to have. So we have a continuous history from 1945 to 2019 of progress in nuclear in Canada. Anyway, with that, I think we're going to go to an introduction to my fellow reactor scientists, and we'll talk a bit about what we do, where we've come from, how we got here, and we'll, after that, open the floor up for questions. Okay, thanks guys. So I'll just first introduce my colleagues here. So I have Raveena and Julian with me. They'll speak their piece shortly. Anyway, so we've got two connections. First, we've been working on how to enhance ZED-2's use for education at all levels. So this has been an ongoing project, and we've been using ZED-2 for education specifically for about 10 years in varying capacities, and probably more prior to that. Second, we've all traveled fairly varied paths to get here, where we are as reactor scientists. So I'd like to talk about some of our experiences, and hopefully they'll be useful for you, whatever stage you may be at, whether in high school, considering a career, in university, also considering a career, or even mid-career. And honestly, just for interest's sake, it's really not about just picking a career in nuclear per se, but it's about knowledge and knowing some of the things that we have going on here. Anyway, so I'll start with myself. So I studied physics at the University of Waterloo, and I really enjoyed it. And on co-op terms, graduate school had been recommended to me. So I pursued that, and I ended up doing a master's in low temperature physics. And that really resonated with me, and I really enjoyed it. And because of that, I definitely knew that physics and research was the path for me. At some point then, though, I was ready to move on to career instead of sticking in academia. So I ended up looking around, and before you know it, I was hired at the medical physics department at Ryerson University. And that was a really varied job, and great because it was a small, tight-knit, hard-working faculty. And I learned there quite a bit, but also because of medical physics content, I ended up being a little more exposed to radiation physics than I ever had been in my undergrad. I had honestly never taken a course in it. So I really came to like the field, and also started reading up on reactors to understand a little more about neutron physics and how those work. So it really fit with a pursuit of applied research for me. Anyway, after looking around for a bit, I found a position which seemed to suit here at Chalk River. And I didn't know exactly what I'd be doing when I got here, just that I'd be within applied physics, and I knew a couple of the topics. But then I found out the first week that I'd be working with ZED-2. And so I found that to be a great fit. I've really enjoyed what I've been doing here. I felt like the transition from what I was doing in low temperature experimental physics to neutron physics was very natural. It might not sound like it on the surface, but I can get into that a little more later. But with that, I feel like I definitely ended up in the right spot. And so I've been here for almost 4 years, after 3 years at Ryerson. So I did do a bit of an early career change, but it's worked out very well. And it's been a great challenge to be part of a small but passionate team who works with this reactor. And I've really come to love reactor physics and look forward to a long, fulfilling career in it. So that's my experience. I'm going to pass over now to Raveena, and she can share some of how she got here.
Thanks, Luke. Hi, I'm Raveena, and I'm currently on a 3-month secondment in the Applied Physics branch at CNL. So alongside Luke and Julian, I've also been working on some projects that involve the ZED-2 Reactor. So as well as the ZED-2 for Education initiative, I've also been working on characterizing a fast neutron spectrum. So this has involved irradiating foils and neutrons, and looking and observing the reactions that take place, and then using gamma spectroscopy to observe the activity. And then you obtain a spectrum. So this has been a great way of getting some technical experience within the Science and Technology department at CNL. And so the reason I'm actually here is because I'm currently on a program in the UK called Nuclear Graduates. So it's a 2-year program that involves graduates taking 3 to 4 placements in companies throughout the nuclear industry. So I've currently been at Sellafield, Radioactive Waste Management, and Nuvia, all in the UK, and I'm currently on my 4th and final secondment here at CNL. And so the reason that I'm on the Nuclear Graduates program goes back to my education. So I started off by studying physics at university, and then I went on to do nuclear physics. And I think that's when I really realized how broad nuclear really is. I mean, it's more than just nuclear energy. There's waste characterization and decommissioning and so much more. And so I really didn't know which sort of area I wanted to go into. So that's why a program like Nuclear Graduates was really useful, to get that industry experience, to decide which area that I enjoy the most. And I think that Canada does something quite similar in the terms of the co-op program. So I know that courses at universities will allow students to take on the co-op program and go out into industry and take on, a couple of months in industry to really figure out which sort of areas that they enjoy. And so when I finish this secondment, I go back to the UK to start my new role within environmental remediation at Sellafield, and I'll be continuing on with working towards becoming a chartered physicist. So that's something I've been working on throughout the scheme. And I think something similar in Canada is probably the professionalism. So you can become a professional engineer or professional scientist. And in my case, that would have been a professional physicist. So feel free to ask me any more questions on that. But I'll now hand over to Julian.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Julian Atfield. I also work in the applied physics branch working with ZED-2. I actually have quite a bit of overlap with what I do and what Luke does. So I do a lot of planning of experiments to be done in ZED-2 and then analysis of those experiments to support the different projects that we are conducting them for, whether it be through a program at CNL called the Federal Science and Technology Program, or through for commercial enterprises as well, such as the flux detector calibrations that Luke mentioned. We do have quite a lot of overlap in our work, and we're actually pretty much the same age, but I've been working at Chalk River since 2008, so quite a bit longer than Luke. And the reason for that is I came to work here, I went to get an undergraduate degree in physics at Trent University in Peterborough. And then I came to work here more or less directly afterwards. So I don't have a master's degree like Raveena and Luke do. So you could say, okay, I managed to start working here and I have less education than either of them do. But it's fortunate that in an industry like the nuclear industry, you can do quite a lot of training. They're very good for that, a lot of on-the-job training. And I was very good to have some very good mentors when I came to work here. So I've more or less been acquiring skills and learning about the industry and the physics behind it, and developing quite a bit of expertise as far as how to do experiments to study nuclear physics during that time. So it's really nice to have had that opportunity. I would say, you can see that there's a bit of a variety in how each of us came to work here for this summer. I've had quite a bit of experience working here in what I would call a fairly large company, where you have a lot of specialized groups, and you need to interact with all of them in order to get a project done. You end up developing a team, and there's people who work in radiation protection or project management, business development, nuclear materials controls, and you have to interact with each of them, and you kind of have your own area of expertise that you draw upon to work with them. And what I've noticed when Luke came to work with us in 2015, I think, Luke? Yeah. He mentioned his experience at Ryerson, where he was part of a small group, and in that small faculty, they had to do quite a bit more for themselves to figure out how to do those things. And so I think bringing that expertise, because we work in R&D, so you can imagine we're doing a lot of experiments and things that nobody has the experience with, and we're kind of developing these methods techniques, and also trying to build things for the first time. So having that experience to draw upon when Luke came here has been really valuable. And then similarly with Raveena, both of you I think mentioned the ZED-2 for Education initiative, which this is kind of a side project of. We're trying to figure out how to engage more students and use some of the infrastructure we have at CNL to do this. And Raveena's been able to come here and give us a bit of an outsider perspective, and also maybe define some messages that we could use to communicate with students, because she has a bit of experience in education herself previously. So I think it's been really good that we have these varied backgrounds to draw upon. Yeah, that's really all I have to say.
Thanks for that, guys. So yeah, as you can see, we've got a good variety here of ways that we came at where we are. On Raveena's note about cooperative education, or really any way that you can gain some sort of field experience, yeah, having done a co-op program myself, I would say it's invaluable. And if there's one piece of advice I would give to anybody going into post-secondary education, it would be to attempt to get yourself in some sort of cooperative education program. Extremely valuable for learning what you like, what you don't like, and really just gaining experience. It's a bit tough, I think, for all of us, as we realize that often the experience is the bit of the hiccup when you're trying to get a job. And yeah, unless somebody will give you a job, you cannot get experience. So that's a great way to get going. And also just, again, use it for you to find out what you like and what you don't like. And to Julian's point about mentorship as well. So that's something in the nuclear industry that's really tough. There's a bit of a generational gap, and that we've been able to bridge that somewhat. So I joined not straight out of school, and I've benefited in a very big way from Julian's experience, where he was able to join right out of school and really gain a lot from previous mentorship, and I've been able to capitalize on that from him as a mentor as well. So much of the nuclear field seems to rely a bit on sort of continuity of knowledge and tribal knowledge. There's a lot there, and it's a lot that hasn't necessarily been put down on paper. So, but that also makes it a really fun challenge to chase and to try to look after that. One more comment about what you heard here. You've heard from 3 physicists, so obviously there's a lot more to reactor scientists than that. If you're in a chemistry class, if you're an engineer, civil, electrical, mechanical, there's definitely a place for everybody. Biology, there's quite a broad, there's very broad field of applicability in nuclear. So really you could be doing just about any discipline, technical discipline, and find a really engaging career for yourself in this kind of work. Similarly, it's just a great thing to know about on the side as a private citizen to understand a bit about this method of generating power, about this method of generating medical isotopes, about this method of you name it, like lots of possibilities there. So that's pretty much all I had to say. You guys good? Yeah? Okay. Well, we'll see if we've got any questions.
We definitely have some questions. Rose, I will get back to your question. I'm just going to get some of the ones from the classes first off. So the first one is, one of my students would like to know what your favorite part of working at CNL is.
The reactor, for sure. So right now ZED-2 is the only reactor here on site. And I just think it's amazing that it's here and the things that it can do and that it's still operating. If I had to refine it about that specifically, it would be dreaming up work for it. So work comes in, but also we're thinking hard about how we can reach out and just see what possibilities we have. So my favorite is just being given the freedom to think about that and work towards that. You guys have a favorite about working at CNL?
So coming from organisations that I would contrarily say are a lot larger, I'd say something I really enjoy about CNL is the community feel. There are a lot of different teams and groups within CNL, and I've seen the collaborative work between them, and I've just found it a really welcoming atmosphere, like personally.
Yeah, for me, I think Luke basically took what I would have said. It's the creativity that goes along with working in R&D, designing these experiments. If you have a particular problem, and the problem solving that goes into it is, I find that really, really fulfilling, especially when you can get together and come up with something as a group to solve a problem that might have been around for a long time. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, one of my students wants to know if you have to replace the nuclear rods, and if yes, how often?
Good question. So, thanks, Lauren. I found the camera now. So no, we don't actually, and this is a function of ZED-2 being so low in power in that we don't burn up the fuel. So the fuel is pretty darn near the same composition as the day it was made. And I don't know how to describe it other than that we when we do run the reactor for the short periods we do at the low powers, we're really just sipping, at what's there in terms of energy potential. So because of that, we still have the fuel from ZEEP, and it's not burned up, it's not used up. And then so on and so forth. For those of you familiar with the nuclear power demonstration reactor, there's demonstration fuel from that reactor as well, from 1960, and on up through the years. So it includes fuels that aren't even in conventional reactors yet. They they've been tested and looked at and proofed here, but we're sort of ahead of it. So even that stuff, there's basically no fixed end date. You could calculate it, but I think it'd be much longer than what we'll be around for if you were to run continuously.
Okay. One of my students wants to know what can cause a nuclear meltdown. What are the safety precautions to avoid such a disaster?
So a nuclear meltdown would be a runaway feedback. So the melting is the key there. So you get so much heat that you can't dissipate, which is usually taken away with coolant, that it literally melts the fuel. And so there's all sorts of variations that can happen there. So what's used is some form of safety system. And so I showed you all the ZED-2 safety system, which is the dump valves. That in the case of here, and the safety case for ZED-2 is built around being so far from a meltdown that it's unimaginable. Like everything's been built to a smaller envelope. But then typically in a CANDU, say, there's absorber systems that are injected. There's what's called shutdown rods, and so there's a few materials that are very potent at sucking up those neutrons that are out there, and could cause subsequent fission. And so what you really have to do is just remove those from the equation. So in ZED-2's case, the safety system is to remove the moderator, remove the thing that slows down the neutrons, and sort of clip the chain reaction at that point. In say a CANDU, the key is to add an absorber, and that then takes away those free neutrons, and then you just it's a balance equation where you're not producing anymore because there's no neutrons to go and produce. So I hope that catches it there.
Okay. And then there's a question, is there a big push by CNL for developing small nuclear reactors for the future development of nuclear industry versus building large nuclear plants? Yeah, and there's a lot of content on the external website that speaks to that. There's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of things to consider and things to be worked out. It's really neat to be in Canada right now for that, and at CNL, because there is such a big push to be a host site and to really do things that align with our mission of being a science and technology organization, and to provide that science and technology, to use things we've either looked at in the past or things that we have the capability to look at in the future, and spin that into into new productive ways of making fuel that might be better than the ones used in the past, might be more economical, scalable, all of those features. So I'd say a very big push, and we're trying to fit into that in what ways we can.
In ZED-2 specifically, we've been really looking at ways that we can support that as well. So we've been really pushing that. We don't want to think of ZED-2, and I know I spoke to it today as can-do relevant, but we've been really looking to help dispel that and show that ZED-2 is really a tank that you can put in a variety of things and still have it function as intended, but it could be an experiment that tells you a little bit about some future reactor. So I think that's the reason for being for ZED-2 is to do experiments to proof that something works, whether it's a model or data. And so what we would like to do is to continue to push along that. So that's one of the things we actually get to be really creative about and think of ways to do that.
Okay, so that's all the questions I have right now. I did put a comment there. If there are any other questions, feel free to type them in. But I'm just going to do a little plug here for our programs. This was quite high level, and if there were more questions, if this led to wanting further explanations or in-class presentations, we do still have our school resources available to you. And there are all different types of careers here at CNL. So I know you guys talked about the technical ones. Could you maybe mention some of the other people that work within this building that maybe aren't related straight to ZED-2?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Lauren. There's a huge variety. So if I start down at one end of the building, there's a shop, a machine shop. So as part of a good science and technology or R&D environment, you're usually doing things that haven't been done before, that you can't necessarily go to a local hardware store or even a very complicated hardware store and buy, and so you have to make them. I can think of a couple examples for things we're doing this year where it's not something we can pick up, and so there's a great trades presence here in the building and on site, which is totally vital to doing what we need. There's also radiation protection, so quite a few people there, and really just they have a huge suite of responsibilities, making sure that everything is ticking along quite nicely. There is also I'm not drawing a blank here. I'm just trying to figure out the order of operations. There's quite a few operations staff as well who we work very closely with, and all of these professions end up being technical in some way or another, but so there's a great operations team that actually runs the ZED-2 reactor, and there's also a few other labs, well, more than a few in the building that also need that staff to run. There is there's a few of the divisions located here, so you have some people who are responsible for our leadership and direction, and managing us and keeping us all on the same page. So that's really important as well. I don't know. Can you guys think of anything else that I'm missing?
I think in the building it's kind of interesting because there is a lot of technical staff. We have a lot of labs actually located in this building as well. This reactor is actually attached to another building that we have on site that actually my office is located in. And we actually have a large detector that uses muons coming from space in order to scan different materials that they can put into it. So a lot of research and technical staff in the building. But Luke mentioned, I mean, elsewhere on site, I'm going to do a huge disservice because there's so many groups on site, whether or not it's people in transportation or radioactive material transportation or people in nuclear materials control that are responsible for ensuring that our nuclear materials are safeguarded and all our inventories are looked after. There's people in criticality safety. So when you were talking, when the question was asked about how do we ensure that meltdowns don't occur, that applies to within the reactor, but also outside of the reactor, we have a whole team of people that do calculations and make sure that can't ever happen. There's people in business development who facilitate our interactions with our commercial customers as well, and a lot of project managers that manage that interaction. think who else. So, there's occupational health and safety as well. Yeah, training.
Yeah, so a few of those, they were coming to mind as Julian expanded the scope out of the building, which is key. There's the environmental remediation group, which are really sort of following up and transforming our site into a very modern place. And because of that, there's some people doing a lot of really cool work in terms of design and planning and new build and all sorts of things. So it's been really neat to see those changes. Things go down, but then new things come up in their place. So that's been some great imagery to see. And we also have a fantastic communications team, and they've been doing such a great job in supporting us. We're really lucky to have them, and I think they've got a great job, I think, in terms of helping us all look sharp and and bring our message to the outside world. So we're really appreciative of their efforts on that too. So we probably, as Julian said, yeah, it's tough. There are honestly so many groups, and I've been here for 4 years. Julian since 2008, as he said. I definitely don't know everybody or every group yet, and so because of that, I really try to join in on tours when I can, or introduce myself to people when I can. So yeah, it's big and varied, and honestly, you could probably work here for 20 years and then still meet somebody new and learn about a new group, which is also a really great thing. So things don't get old fast. They're always changing and always new groups to get to know what they do because it's so varied.
Perfect. I think this is about right on time to end when we said we would. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, or you can always send an email to us at communications@cnl.ca, and we can always have Luke, Raveena, or Julian follow up, or get you the answer from anyone else you'd like to know something from. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'd love to hear what you thought of it, so feel free to leave that in the chat as well.